What happens in the first 10 minutes after death, according to ancient texts? You take your last breath. Your heart stops. The room falls silent. But you are not gone. According to texts that predate modern religion by thousands of years, what happens in the first 10 minutes after death will determine the course of your entire afterlife journey, and almost no one is prepared for it, not because the knowledge was lost, but because it was hidden, buried in manuscripts that were removed from public teaching, scattered across traditions that were labeled heretical, pagan, or dangerous. Tonight, you're going to learn what those texts actually say, and why the first 10 minutes after death are called the most critical threshold a soul will ever cross. The Tibetan Book of the Dead calls it the Bardo. The Egyptian Book of the Dead describes it as the weighing of the heart. The Gnostic texts refer to it as the Archonic Gauntlet. Different names, different cultures, but the same essential teaching. When the body dies, consciousness does not disappear. It transitions. And in those first moments, before orientation is lost, before memory fades, before confusion sets in, there is a window, a single, unrepeatable opportunity to recognize what is happening and navigate it with awareness. Miss that window, and you enter a state of disorientation that can last for what feels like lifetimes. Here's what most people don't understand. Death is not an ending, it's a separation. The physical body ceases to function, but the consciousness that animated it continues. And in those first moments, that consciousness is still tethered to the identity it held in life. It still thinks it's you. It still remembers your name, your relationships, your fears, your attachments. But the environment has changed completely, and if you don't recognize what's happening, if you don't understand the nature of the transition, you will react with panic. And panic, according to every ancient death text, is the greatest danger. Now, before we go deeper, you need to understand why this knowledge was suppressed, because it wasn't accidental. In the early centuries of institutional religion, teachings about conscious death navigation were systematically removed from doctrine. Why? Because they placed power in the hands of the individual. They suggested that salvation wasn't granted by an external authority. It was achieved through awareness, preparation, and direct knowing, and that threatened the control structures that were being built. So the texts were buried, the practices were forgotten, and entire generations lived and died without understanding what awaited them on the other side. But the texts survived, hidden in monasteries, preserved by mystic orders, passed down through oral traditions that refused to let the knowledge die. And when you read them side by side, when you compare the Tibetan teachings with the Egyptian rituals, with the Gnostic cosmologies, with the early Christian Apocrypha, a consistent map emerges, a map of what happens in those first 10 minutes. And it's far more detailed than anything you've been told in church. Let me walk you through it. The moment your heart stops, the first thing you experience is silence. Not the silence of an empty room, the silence of an absent body. You no longer hear through ears, you no longer see through eyes. But you are still perceiving, still aware. And in that first instant, according to the Bardo Thodol, you are presented with what's called the clear light, a radiance of pure consciousness, undifferentiated, unlimited, without form or identity. This is not a metaphor. Every tradition describes this initial light. The Egyptians called it the light of Ra. The Gnostics called it the pleroma. The Christian mystics called it the presence of God. It is the ground of being, the source from which all consciousness arises. And if you recognize it, if you merge with it without fear or grasping, your journey ends there. You dissolve into union. You transcend the cycle of death and rebirth entirely. But here's the problem. Almost no one recognizes it, because recognition requires preparation. It requires you've spent your life cultivating the capacity to rest in pure awareness without needing identity, story, or form. And most people have done the opposite. They've spent their entire lives building and defending an identity. So when that identity is suddenly stripped away, when the self you thought you were dissolves, the reaction is terror. And terror causes you to recoil from the light, to turn away, to seek something familiar, something solid, something that feels like you. And the moment you turn away, the moment you reject the clear light out of fear or confusion, the second phase begins. The texts call this the phase of peaceful and wrathful deities, but deities is a mistranslation. These are not external beings. They are projections of your own consciousness. Aspects of your psyche that, in life, or hidden beneath the surface. In death, they become visible, tangible, overwhelming. The peaceful deities appear first, radiant beings of compassion, wisdom, and light. They are everything you aspired to be, everything you long for, and they call to you. But if you approach them with attachment, with desire to possess or become them, they shift. They transform into wrathful forms, terrifying, distorted, monstrous. This is where the ancient texts become deeply psychological. They understood something that modern science is only beginning to grasp. That consciousness, when freed from the constraints of the body, experiences its own content directly. Your beliefs become your environment. Your fears become entities. Your unresolved traumas become landscapes you must navigate. And in those first 10 minutes, before the dying consciousness fully detaches from the life it just left, everything you suppressed, everything you denied, everything you refused to face rises to the surface. The Egyptian texts describe this as the weighing of the heart. The god Anubis places your heart on a scale opposite the feather of Maat, the principle of truth. If your heart is heavy with unresolved guilt, fear, or deception, it tips the scale, and you are devoured by Ammit, the soul leader. But this is not punishment. It's a symbolic representation of what happens when consciousness is consumed by its own shadows. When it cannot face the truth of what it has been, the devouring is not literal. It's a fragmentation, a scattering of awareness into confusion and forgetting. But if your heart is light, if you've lived with integrity, if you've faced your shadows in life and integrated them, the scales balance, and you are granted passage into the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, not as a reward, but as a natural consequence of consciousness that has achieved coherence. This is the hidden teaching. Heaven and hell are not destinations assigned by judgment. They are states of being generated by the quality of consciousness you cultivated. Now let's talk about what the Gnostic texts add to this. They describe the afterlife as a series of spheres ruled by archons, entities that feed on fear and attachment. When you die, your soul must ascend through these spheres to return to the pleroma, the fullness of divine reality. But at each threshold, the archons challenge you. They demand passwords. They test your knowledge. They try to convince you that you are unworthy, that you are still bound, that you must submit to their authority. And if you believe them, if you bow to their power, you are trapped. Recycled back into incarnation without memory, without progress, without liberation. But the Gnostic initiates were taught the passwords, the secret names, the formulas of recognition, not as magic words, but as keys of understanding, statements of identity that could not be refuted. I am a child of the light. I know the name of my true Father. I bear the seal of the living one. These declarations were not about belief. They were about gnosis, direct knowing, the unshakable certainty that comes from inner experience, not borrowed doctrine. And here's where all the traditions converge. The key to navigating the first 10 minutes after death is the same key that unlocks spiritual power in life. Awareness without attachment, presence without grasping, the ability to witness your own experience without being consumed by it. In the Tibetan teachings, this is called recognizing the nature of mind. In the Egyptian teachings, it's called knowing the true name. In the Gnostic teachings, it's called awakening from the dream. Different language, same realization. But first, you must understand what happens if you fail to maintain awareness. If you panic, if you grasp, if you try to cling to the identity you just lost, the texts say you enter a state called the intermediate realm, a dreamlike space where time behaves strangely, where thought manifests instantly, where you are surrounded by visions of loved ones, familiar places, comforting illusions. And it feels real. It feels like you're still alive. Like maybe the death didn't happen, like you've been given a second chance. This is the most dangerous trap, because the intermediate realm is not life. It's a projection, a replay of habitual patterns. And the longer you remain in it, the deeper you sink into confusion. You begin to forget that you died. You begin to believe the illusion. And eventually, you are drawn toward rebirth, toward a new body, a new identity, a new cycle. And the opportunity for liberation is lost. The Tibetan masters taught that this process unfolds in stages. In the first minutes after death, while the consciousness is still clear, still capable of recognition, a trained practitioner can achieve instant liberation. But if that moment is missed, the process becomes progressively harder. The consciousness grows dimmer. The visions become more seductive. The attachments become more compelling. And by the time the soul is drawn toward rebirth, usually within what the texts describe as 49 days, the window is closed. The next opportunity won't come until the next death. And if you weren't prepared for this one, what makes you think you'll be prepared for the next? This is why the ancient traditions emphasized preparation, not after death. During life, the Egyptian initiates practiced conscious dying in the temples. They would lie in sarcophagi and enter trance states where they simulated the death experience. They rehearsed the passwords. They visualized the journey. They familiarized themselves with the terrain of the afterlife, so that when the real moment came, they would not be caught off guard. The Tibetan monks did the same through dream yoga and follow practice. They trained themselves to maintain awareness during sleep, because sleep is a miniature death. Every night, your consciousness separates from your sensory experience. Every night, you enter a realm of visions and symbols, and if you can learn to remain lucid in that state, if you can recognize the dream while you're dreaming it, you develop the exact skill you'll need when death comes. Because death is the ultimate dream. The ultimate test of whether you've mistaken the projection for reality. And the Gnostic Christians, before their texts were burned and their communities destroyed, practiced something similar. They engaged in rituals of symbolic death and resurrection. They entered altered states through fasting, chanting, and contemplation. They sought direct encounters with the divine light while still in the body, so that when they encountered it after death, it would be familiar. Not terrifying, not foreign, but recognized, like coming home. Now here's the practice they all shared, the technique that appears in every tradition. Breath awareness, not breathing exercises. Awareness of breath, because breath is the bridge between body and consciousness. In life, it anchors you to the physical. In death, when the breath stops, your awareness of where that anchor was becomes the guide. The Tibetan texts say that at the moment of death, consciousness exits the body through one of several points. The crown for the liberated, the heart for the compassionate, the lower centers for those still bound by desire and fear. And the point of exit is determined by where your awareness habitually rests during life. If you spend your life identified with physical sensation, with survival, with base impulses, your awareness sinks. And when death comes, you exit through the lower gates, and the realms you encounter match that vibration. Dense, dark, binding. But if you spend your life cultivating awareness in the heart, in compassion, in presence, in the crown, in unity, that's where your consciousness naturally rises, and the realms you encounter are luminous, liberating, expansive. This is not reward and punishment. This is physics. Consciousness moves toward resonance, toward familiarity, toward the frequency it is practiced. So the question isn't what will happen to you after death. The question is, what are you practicing right now? Where does your awareness live? What are you feeding with your attention? Because that's what will greet you in those first 10 minutes. And here's what you'll notice if you begin this practice today. You'll start to see that death isn't something waiting in the future. It's happening constantly. Every thought dies. Every emotion dies. Every motion dies and gives birth to the next. And if you can learn to let those small deaths happen without grasping, without clinging, without trying to make the moment last longer than it naturally does, you're training yourself for the final transition. You're practicing the art of letting go while remaining aware. The ancient texts weren't written for scholars. They were written as manuals, as maps, as training guides for the most important journey you'll ever take. And the tragedy is that most people encounter death completely unprepared. They've spent their entire lives avoiding the thought of it, distracting themselves from it, building elaborate belief systems that promise them safety without requiring them to develop actual skill. And when the moment comes, when the body fails and the familiar world dissolves, they are helpless, confused, terrified, at the mercy of whatever currents pull them. But you don't have to be, because the knowledge exists, the practices exist, the maps exist, and they all point to the same truth, that consciousness survives death, that what you are is not your body, that the awareness reading these words right now is the same awareness that will witness your last breath and your first perception of what lies beyond. And if you train that awareness now, if you stabilize it, if you root it in presence rather than in identity, You will navigate those first 10 minutes with clarity. You'll recognize the clear light when it appears. You'll merge with it instead of recoiling from it. Or if you miss that moment, you'll recognize the visions as projections. You'll speak the words of power that dissolve the archons. You'll maintain awareness to the intermediate realm. You'll choose your next step consciously instead of being pulled by unconscious habit. This is what the initiates knew. This is what the mystery schools taught. This is what was hidden from you. And in the coming days, you're going to feel something shift. Not because you've learned new information, but because something old has been remembered, a knowing that was always there but covered over by fear, by distraction, by the noise of a life lived on the surface. You're going to notice the small deaths happening all around you, the end of conversations, the end of days, the end of versions of yourself that no longer serve. And instead of resisting them, you're going to let them go. And in that letting go, you're going to discover something extraordinary. That death is not the enemy. It's the teacher. It's the force that strips away everything false and leaves only what's real. And if you can befriend it now, if you can meet it with awareness instead of avoidance, it will show you who you actually are. Not the body, not the name, not the story, but the consciousness that witnesses all of it. The light that was never born and can never die. Those who understand this walk differently. They live without the background hum of existential fear, not because they've escaped death, but because they've seen through the illusion that they were ever separate from the source to which death returns them. They know the secret the ancient texts were written to convey, that the first 10 minutes after death are not a test you pass or fail. They're a revelation you're finally ready to see. If this has awakened something in you, if you feel the truth of it resonating in a place deeper than thought, leave a comment with the words, "I am ready to see." Not as a plea, as a recognition, as an acknowledgement that you're no longer content with borrowed beliefs and secondhand promises. You want direct knowing, and if you're prepared to go further, to explore the practices that prepare consciousness for this transition, subscribe, because what comes next will take you into the actual techniques the masters used, the meditations they practiced, the internal maps they followed, and none of it requires faith, only willingness. You were always going to die. That was never in question. The only question is whether you'll meet that moment awake or asleep, aware or confused, sovereign or helpless. The ancient texts were written so you could choose, and now you know they exist. Now you know what they contain. Now you have no excuse. The first 10 minutes after death are coming. For all of us, make sure you're ready.